Welcome. I'm Carl Frederick, and I will be interviewing individuals for Kenosha Voices, an oral history project of the Kenosha County Historical Society in conjunction with Kenosha Community Media. I have worked in newspapers for more than 40 years as an editor and a reporter. 38 and a half of those years were at the Kenosha News. I am also a member of the Kenosha County Historical Society Board. We hope you enjoy these programs. I'm speaking with John Valaske, former administrator at the University of Wisconsin-Parkside. Thank you, John, for joining me today.
Yes, you're very welcome.
Can you talk to me a little bit about post-secondary education in Kenosha prior to the University of Wisconsin at Parkside? What was it like after high school? Where could you go to school, college in the area?
Well, that was the question. After high school, I was a student myself at the University Extension, which at that time was located in the vocational school on 6th Avenue and 52nd, which is now the municipal building. And at that time, the vocational school housed the University Extension classes in that building, and the university at that time had, maybe 250 students that started at the extension with the idea of after 2 years at the extension, you could transfer to Madison and finish your last 2 years up there and get a bachelor's degree.
Okay. Who taught the classes at the extension?
The extension was directed by Bernard Talent, who also taught political science. And there were several other instructors who either lived in Kenosha or were in Kenosha and Racine primarily, and there were a few that came down from Madison just to teach one class and then go back.
Okay, and did the extension experience any kind of changeover that the vocational school no longer was going to use part of their building or classrooms for extension students? Was there an issue
Well,
there?
that was true in the later years. The way the setup was that around the state, if the extension classes needed space, the vocational school would give it to the extension, provided that they had availability. Now, in Kenosha, it happened that there were 4 classrooms we had on a regular basis, plus others that were needed as demand required. But after, into the 60s, the vocational school was expanding their program, and they wanted to have 2-year associate degrees, which they did not previously have. I recall they had practical nursing at the extension. They had their students right across the hall from the offices that the university had. So when Eugene Lehrman took over from Max Clark, who had been the director of the vocational school, Lehrman wanted to expand the program for these 2-year associate degrees. So then the university was sort of given an eviction notice that by a certain date that they would have to give up the space that we had at the extension.
What year was that?
Well, that would have been 1958, 59, and then there was an active citizens committee at that time was formed in order to find a new location for the extension because the time was running out and they needed to have some place for the continuation of the program.
Okay, and what happened? Where did they move to? How did they accomplish this?
Well, they had several other locations. Eventually, they had talked about having it on the lakefront at Wolfenbüttel Park. That was a possibility. And then there was another possibility to have it at, well, the high school annex was still in business then, but it was being talked about for having a new high school, that building might be available. So what eventually happened was that the Extension Citizens Committee had got the city council and the county board to come together and decide on a location for the building for housing. The 2-year extension then would be on Washington Road and 39th Avenue. Now that site was already owned by the county. They had, Willowbrook and Brookside right next door there, and there was area which was vacant, but it had been a poor farm for people to grow crops during the Depression. So that site then was available really at no additional cost to the taxpayers. So the city then is their part of the deal. They extended sewer and water out on Washington Road in order to service the new extension building. So that cost then was split 50-50 between the city and the county to provide for a new facility there. And as I remember, why it was just under $1 million for the two entities that paid for it. So it opened then in the fall of 1961.
Okay, and you had already graduated from college by then. Is that correct?
Had what?
You had already graduated from college by that year.
Oh, by that time. Oh, yeah, we forgot.
Oh, no, we don't. No.
But I came back. I was not only a student, and I knew Bernard Talent. He was a political science instructor. Then I knew his wife, Rita. And then I was also on that committee then,
Okay.
when I was still in Madison,
Okay.
to help with the site and that sort of thing. So then I came back to work down in the old building downtown at the vocational school when we still had extension classes there. And then I came along to the new building then on Washington Road in 61.
Okay, and what was your job at the time?
Well, I had been assistant to the dean. Well, Bernard Talent was called the dean at that time, even though he had been initially called the director of the extension. And the director of the extension then was primarily a local person for handling the nuts and bolts of the program, whereas all of the faculty then were hired by the department chairman in Madison, and they would send down the people that they felt would be appropriate to teach the first 2 years at the extension. So Talon's title then was changed in 1965 to dean. So he was the first dean of the extension. And there were 7 other extension centers around the state, and at that time those titles were changed too.
Okay, so teachers, instructors came to Kenosha from Madison to teach the classes, and they were employees of the university at Madison. Is that right?
Yes, see, the extension classes then, say if you take English 1A or 101, why your textbooks, all of the assignments and everything were the same as somebody who took the class in Madison. And it was the same way with political science, with history, with psychology, all of those courses that were in order to make uniformity, because your transcript was issued on the same kind of paper as it was if you were a student in Madison. The numbers were the same, the courses, the grade point was figured the same way, so that the idea was that it was not in any way inferior to what it would be if you went right off to Madison. You had to meet the same requirements to get into the extension as you would to get into Madison.
Okay, so the teachers were responsible to the departments back in Madison.
That's correct.
Not to Mr. Talent.
That's correct.
So
yeah.
if there was a complaint or an issue, what could Mr. Talent do or couldn't do?
Well, he tried to salve the complaint. Well, that didn't happen too often, but I guess we could mention one now. There was a chemistry professor that had talking about, well, it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis and atomic bombs and all that stuff. So he had some kind of a feeling about local chemistry was not the same as it should have been. So there were complaints about that he was able to take care of, and then it was just troubles like that happen. You know, occasionally complaints about certain instructors, kids thought that it was unfair treatment, that sort of thing. So he was very good at ameliorating any kind of difficulties that we had like that. Yeah.
And what was your job as assistant to Bernard Talent?
Oh, pretty much whatever. Yeah, pretty much whatever he wanted me to do, and I had a lot of I had a lot of ideas for improving things because I had been a student myself, and I knew some of the difficulties as far as schedules. That I liked certain times for classes that he thought that I had a math class that I took. It was from 12:05 to 12:55, all over the noon hour, 4 days a week. And I said to him one time, you know, who dreamed up the schedule? And he said that it was primarily for people who were working toward a degree, and they would come in on their lunch hour, and then they would be able to get their credits for this math class. So that was a problem that continued on, the idea that you had to make a determination between the students who were full-time, that's all they were doing, and then the students who were working part-time and trying to work a class into your schedule. So when those days ended in '61 by opening up a new building now on Washington Road with additional enrollment at that time, enabled us to have day classes and night classes, especially for the popular classes that had a wide enrollment. You know.
And you worked for Bernard Talent for how long?
I worked where?
For Bernard Talent for how long?
Well, he died in 1965. It was a sad story, really, that he had really put a lot of effort into getting the new building built that opened in '61, and he had whether he had any previous heart trouble, why I don't know, but he had felt ill in the fall of '65, and he had been to the doctor, and he came back, and he felt that he was doing better, and then he had come to work one day, and he sort of collapsed in my office, which was, of course, right next door to his, and then he didn't want his wife Rita to know about it, so I took him to Dr. Goldstein, who was a physician downtown. He was also a heart doctor, and he got some prescriptions that he wanted, and I took him home, and then he seemed to be doing better, and then a week later, during the night, he had this heart aneurysm that burst, and then he died.
What happened to your job after that?
Well, I stayed on. It was a major shift because the way the university operated was that the dean was appointed by the chancellor of the extension centers. So in Madison then, he decided that he would appoint an interim dean. And it turned out that it was a physics instructor that we had been there just for a year or two, but he was 62. He had been retired from a job at Western Electric down outside of Chicago. He was an engineer there. That was Art Ogden, and Mr. Ogden then was named the interim dean.
And then you worked as his assistant then?
Yes, for that continued on. So then that was in the second semester then of '65, going into '66. Then he stayed on from '66 to '67. Then at that time, I have to get the chronology here.
They named a new dean.
Yes, in '67. But the new dean was also going to be responsible to the new chancellor at Parkside, which was Irv Wiley. And Mr. Wiley had been named chancellor of the University of Wisconsin Southeast. He was named chancellor in May of '66, which was before the campus had even been decided on where it was going to be. So anyway, there were two chancellors then that were involved in the hiring of Steve Mitchell, who became dean of the extension before Parkside was even built.
Okay, tell me how Parkside came to be built and where it ended up being located.
Oh, that was a lot of fun because we had some of the same people, and this is interesting, the chronology between the Citizens Committee to get the new extension. Well, that was in '60. Now here we're in '66, and we're talking about not only the extension, but we're talking about a whole new four-year campus.
And Racine also had an extension at the time.
Yes, they did.
And then Parkside was to be a combination of those two extensions?
That's what the thought was, yeah.
Okay.
See, Racine did not have classes in the vocational school. They had their own building. When we were in vocational, we were so envious of Racine that they could have classes all by themselves without any of the vocational students that were there because they had to go to school until they were 16 or 18 or whatever it was. But they were in what was called the McMinn Building, downtown Racine. That was an old elementary school that Racine had that full time. And then they built a new extension on South Main Street that was their new building in the 60s. So both of us had new buildings at that time. But when Wiley was hired as chancellor, the site of the new four-year campus was not decided yet, just that it was going to be in southeastern Wisconsin. One in southeast, one in northeast. That was the trade-off with the legislature in order to have one part of the state supported at the other part of the state. So Wiley then spent a lot of time when he was first hired traveling to other parts of the country to look at other universities that started from scratch. So it was a rare opportunity for something like that to happen, because so many other places had a long history, or they expanded from a state college into a university or something like that. But here was a chance from scratch to start a new building and a new program. So he traveled. There was some in California. There was one outside of Toronto in Ontario, and got all kinds of ideas for having a new campus right from scratch. So they had another committee for the site selection, and the Kenosha committee had option on land between the Washington Road site to the north where Bullen Middle School is now. That acreage in there was proposed to the state for having the four-year university could build right on to what the two-year already had. So in order to encourage the site committee, which one of the members of it was Fred Harrington, he was president of the university, they had them all come down and tour the campus, and they hired a helicopter from Janesville to come to Kenosha and get this committee together. And they took them up in the helicopter to show them how this wonderful site was proposed up towards Bullen.
Now, there were other sites as well that were proposed.
Yes.
Is that correct?
There were other sites, though, that were not really supposedly part of the deal. So when Harrington was up in the helicopter, he looks down here at the Schwartz Nursery, and he says, "Gee, that looks pretty nice, you know, down there. That would be a nice place." But we hadn't considered that. So they thought, well, you know, if we could keep it in Kenosha, that was the idea, not to let it get up there to Racine, that we wanted to have it in Kenosha, that Kenosha would buy the land, whatever it cost. And it turned out it was some 700 acres there at the Schwartz farm. A nursery.
Well, there was another farm there at the same time.
Yes.
Right, yes, there was a Thompson
Orchard, yes. That's right. So they said, if you'll keep it here and not let it go out to Bong Air Base, which was one of the vacant sites at that time, that they could have had it out there for no cost. Or there was another site that was Short Hills Country Club up on 41 up towards Milwaukee, and Racine didn't want to be left out. They said, well, we can fill in the lakefront right there behind the extension on South Main Street. We can fill in the lakefront. We'll get sand down from Indiana the way Northwestern University did in Evanston. We can fill that up, and we'll have a wonderful place on the lakefront for the new university. So that idea didn't really go very far. So then the committee finally decided that it would be built after they had acquired the land, and that was another fight about the value of the land, how they were going to acquire it, what the price was going to be. The farmers on the land, they didn't want to give it up, and there were disagreements, about that. But that was all finally settled, so that Wiley now had been on the job since '66, so we're getting into '67, '68 now, and he's hoping to open up the new campus by '69. So we're a year ahead of Racine, which was not a year ahead of Green Bay. They didn't open until a year later, but that's another situation. But another problem that hadn't been solved was what you were going to call the place, because all the stories in the newspaper called it the University of Wisconsin Southeast. And Wiley thought that was terrible. He said that there are so many other universities around the country, like Missouri especially, University of Missouri this, University of Missouri that. He thought that somehow that was undistinguished, and it shouldn't be named either after Kenosha or Racine. We wanted to keep both cities happy, even though it was going to be in Kenosha County. So he chose the name himself. It's going to be Parkside. And he said that will indicate to people that feel that Petrifying Springs Park is going to be taken over by the university, that, oh, you're just building it here now, and then you're really going to take over the park eventually. So he says, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to have it right here on the 700 acres that has been selected, for the site. That was always a problem in Madison, that they didn't have enough main campus to expand up there. So they were always tearing down buildings and expanding. But that would not happen here.
So then building started at the campus. And what were the first two buildings built?
Well, the first two were Talon and Greenquist. Now, the architecture of the buildings, that was another problem, because so far as everybody remembered was that if it was a state building, you had to have a state architect. But Wiley somehow was able to get permission to get some well-known architectural firm out of St. Louis, which would be different from what had happened before. And the name of the firm was Helmuth, Obata, and Kassebaum, going by the initials HOK. So they designed the first two buildings plus the master plan, which was going to be for the whole campus in the future. Whether they got future contracts for architectural work, why the people that built would still follow the master plan.
And at this time, your job was to do, what was your job at that time?
Well, I was still working for the dean.
Okay, so
Yeah, the
Steve
dean,
Mitchell was still there?
Dean Mitchell, yeah.
Okay.
He had been promoted, and he was a Madison PhD in political science, and he had been at Washington State in Pullman. Then he had been at Calgary in Alberta, Canada. So he came down from Canada, and then he took over. We were still at the Kenosha campus then, at that time, before Parkside was started. Yeah.
So in 1969, the first two buildings went up. The first two buildings were built in 1969 for Parkside.
That's correct.
Okay.
There was Talon Hall on one side of the campus, then Greenquist Hall was on the other side. And there was a shuttle bus service. Thought it was too far to walk between the two buildings. But if you had ever been to Madison, why, you would think that was pretty easy. But it was, the master plan that was developed showed that all of the parking would be remote. In other words, you would come in off Highway A, and you would have a parking lot there, and you would come in off Highway 31, you'd have a parking lot on the west side of the campus. And then the shuttle bus would go around this loop, and that would take care of the parking problem. So the cost of that, though, was rather prohibitive to have the bus service. Then you had to have the parking lots, and you have to have the maintenance. So that changed when Governor Lucey, Pat Lucey, then was a Democrat, had taken over from Governor Knowles, who was a Republican. And Lucey said that your parking is going to be paid for by user fees, student fees. They were going to pay for the parking. It wasn't going to be free, just like you'd expect it to be. So that changed the whole thing. When that happened, then they could no longer afford to have this remote parking with everything far away and provide shuttle bus services, because they were going to run day and night. If you had a lecture or something in one building, why, all the people that came to the lecture, they were going to be able to get on the bus, and they were going to run every 3 minutes, and that was a major expense. So that didn't work out. But there were ideas that were part of the master plan then that were not really implemented.
Were there any other issues before Parkside got
Well,
off the
not
ground?
right away. Now, Wiley then was hired as chancellor by the president of the university, Fred Harrington, was history department chairman at one time when Wiley was on the staff of history in Madison. So they had a very close relationship. And at the time he was hired, there was not really a lot of consultation with faculty and townspeople the way there would be now. If you hired a new chancellor, you would see all these community groups, all of the stakeholders, as they call them now, would have say-so as to what the person would be. But Wiley had his own ideas about how the place should be run and how things should be handled. So part of the difficulty came that Wiley had hired vice chancellor, was Otto Bauer, and he had hired a dean, would be like a liberal arts dean, and that was Arthur McKinney. They were hired for those important jobs, and part of it was to build up staff for the 4-year, because we had staff from the 2-year that were here already, and at the time they knew that it was going to be a different situation. So some of the 2-year people left to continue on with other centers where they would have the same relationship with the departments that they had previously at Kenosha. So we had a whole list of what we called ad hoc instructors, or lectures, you'd call them now, that came in just for 1 or 2 classes. And there were well over 100 at that time. When you look at that directory, it's just amazing that first 2 years from 69 to 71, just how many part-time people from other campuses were providing the instruction. So these two new faculty members then were taking it on themselves to expand the roster, plus the concern was that some of the people that were not going to other extension centers but wanted to stay on at Parkside might not meet the qualifications for the new campus.
And so was this a big deal?
Well, it was in the sense that one of the new deans gave a lecture one time about what he called was instant greatness. And instant greatness means that you had to bring in a lot of new people that were at higher rank, like associate and full professors, that you would have that would change the campus. So that was another question, that initially it was supposed to be a research campus as well as a campus for master's degrees. It was going to be more than just a bachelor's degree. It was going to be a completely different kind of thing, because there was Madison, Milwaukee, Green Bay, and Parkside. Those four campuses were at a higher level than Whitewater, Stevens Point,
The State College.
Eau Claire, that sort of thing. Yeah, those were state colleges. They weren't universities. See, that was the idea, that the University of Wisconsin was separate from that. Yeah.
And did this cause any problems with current?
Well, there was a problem one year when the two academic affair officers, either the well, now Otto Bauer was not, he was the second vice chancellor. Okay, I have to go back. The first vice chancellor was the one that bore the brunt for the shakeup that they had. They went through all the files of all the faculty. Then they decided that some of them were not going to be qualified. So this was in December of 1970 that they had, a lot of them were not going to be renewed. And they were told that they would be all finished in June. This was December. It was going to be just half a year later. So there was a big ruckus with the students. There were demonstrations that they felt that some of their favorite teachers were not going to be continued on. So they had all kinds of problems, with that. And there was such a commotion about it that they decided to drop the whole thing. We wouldn't follow along with any of these initial evaluations. We would let them go on through the normal course, which meant that if you were hired as an assistant professor, you got an automatic 3-year contract, and then at the end of that, well, then you could be evaluated. So everybody got their jobs back. There were over 30 people that it affected. So they all got their jobs back, and then the dean was out, the vice chancellor was out, and they got in new people right away. It happened pretty fast. And Wiley said that he was unaware of the action that these two people were taking, that they did that on their own. He was busy with other problems with the startup of the campus, and that he was unaware of what had happened. And he, at that time, you could tell that he had been damaged by the uproar, and somehow that had hurt his credibility, and he had survived. They had a big investigation and all that, and they said that he should continue on, but he had sort of seen that he was not going to be as effective anymore, and he had looked for some other positions, and at one time the papers would have a story that he was a candidate for president at such and such a place and that sort of thing. But the years go by fast, so we're into 71, 72, and then 73, 74. Then he died in 75, 10 years after Bernard Talent.
Okay, so Parkside was then, as you say, in 75, Parkside was stable. All the issues had been worked out from what had been problems
Well, yeah,
before.
pretty much.
And what were you doing at that time?
Well, I was in different organizations, different pieces of work, different summer, had charge of summer classes, all that scheduling. I worked in financial aids, worked as assistant to other people, and then I retired. So I was old. I went from being young to old. And we don't want to forget about what happened with poor Whitewater and Stevens Point and all those people, that when Governor Lucey became governor, in addition to making a kids pay for parking, he said that there were two boards of regents. There was one for the state universities, and there was one for University of Wisconsin. He said those two boards of regents have to be combined. It's non-negotiable. And he was able to get that through, so that they became University of Wisconsin - Whitewater, University of Wisconsin - Stevens Point. So they were all universities, just like Madison, Milwaukee, Parkside, and Green Bay. So everybody then was the University, of Wisconsin. So that that solved that on the letterhead. Just change your letterhead, and then you were a University of Wisconsin.
So how were those years, as you look back on all of your time with the extension and with University of Wisconsin-Parkside, how do you look back on all that time personally?
Well, a lot of things really changed, especially when I went, that there was no financial aid, that our tuition was $75 or $90 later, and that was the same as Madison. So that was all you paid, and you could have a part-time job and work your way through. So in later years, tuition went a lot higher, and then it meant that you couldn't do that anymore. So then financial aid came along from the government. Now it seems like that was around the time Parkside started, say 68, 69, 70, that students could apply for financial aid. You had to fill out all of these forms. They still have it, the federal FAFSA, whatever they call it now, and that it was going to be based on your need. So that helped a lot to let the student decide if he went to a more expensive school and if he could get financial aid, well, then he could go there.
And were you the director of financial aid, or what was your position in financial aid department?
Oh, just you have to go through everybody's everybody's need. That's
No, what was your job? What was your position in financial aid?
Handling the requests and making the awards. And I also had a job after Talon died. We set up a scholarship plan with donations that we received after he died, and we set up our own scholarship foundation with those awards were made every year for students who were qualified to continue on at Parkside. And I served as chairman of that, and I still do that to this day. That the awards now, I used to invest the money on my own through the banks, CDs, that sort of thing. So then a few years ago I figured that I would give that up. It was a concern to me that if I died, then it would be hard to get it transferred over. So I turned over all of the money then to the university so that they could invest it in the way they do that with the university funds, so they could have complete access to that, and then they could make the decision on who would get the talent scholarships, as well as trying to even out some of the distribution, because there are so many scholarships now that are available, and they're quite often from certain organizations. That's in addition to the financial aid that you would get through the federal government, and you have to match those up so that you don't take one away from another and give them too much money, and then you got to take some back. So that's a problem you want to avoid. Yeah.
And what year did you retire?
Well, trying to think when we started here, 1965. Yeah.
No, that's when
No,
you started.
not 65.
No. When did you retire?
I was 65. Yeah. So that would be 2000. Yeah. Yeah. So,
Though you enjoyed your years at Parkside?
pardon?
You enjoyed your years?
Oh yeah,
working
they
there?
were the best years. Yeah. 'Cause well, see, we didn't really get into a lot of the other ideas that I had, and it was interesting that I was able to get some of those ideas in place.
Okay. Well, thank you, John. Thanks for talking with me today.
Glad to be here.